Earth, fire, air, water.
I remember watching Avatar on TV way back in 2005, nearly 20 years ago. Wow, I'm old. Now, I didn't get to see it the whole way through back then until my wife convinced me to watch it with her last year, and boy did it not disappoint. And now with the live action series on Netflix, it feels like the perfect time for me to create a character from the series. And who better than Avatar Aang himself? Over the years, I have had a near obsessive love for the blockout process. That's where every character starts, and I have always touted it as being the most important part of the character creation process, and I, if nothing else, believe that even more today than I have in the past. I feel as if I have perfected my process to a point where my initial blockouts are extremely streamlined and focus in the areas that matter the most. You wouldn't think there would be too much to this part of the process, but the levels of growth I've seen in my own work over the years in this area has been huge, and extremely helpful for deciding the direction of every step following this early portion of creating my characters. I am a sucker for breaking symmetry and posing characters early. One of the massive benefits of working digitally is that you can mirror everything symmetrically and save yourself a ton of time from having to do everything twice. So then it begs the question, why? Why do I love posing early? Wouldn't that create a lot of extra work for myself? Well, it's not always as much of a challenge as you might think. When creating character sculpts in a neutral pose, or T-pose, you're creating a character in an unnatural state. Now that's not such a big deal necessarily, but it can be a waste of time if you aren't rigging and animating your 3D character. For example, my expertise is working in the toy industry, and as such I create high-resolution 3D characters that are polished, posed, and ready for production. So, ironically, posing my characters early on saves me a ton of time from resculpting things like anatomy, folds, or hair that would change during a pose. Obviously, there's no hair here on Aang, so that is at least a little extra time saved. You all know I love sculpting hair and how therapeutic and flow state inducing it can be, so I had the great idea to pose Aang on top of a ball of air. I thought this was the coolest thing back when I was a kid and saw this for the first time, and I of course still think it's awesome, so stick around to see how I go about sculpting wind here very soon. Normally when I start sculpting a character, translating something from 2D to 3D, I have a very clear direction for the design and style of the character. However, here, I knew that I didn't want to create Aang in his traditional style, yet I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. And because of the lack of clarity in direction, I spent a long time noodling on the face. Noodling, for those that don't know, and I'm explaining this because it sounds like I completely made this word up, I promise I didn't, is when you continue to work on something for a long time without it getting any better. So as I work on the face, you'll see it go through many different variations, none of them particularly good, and that is because I am trying to create something completely new. Now, many people say that my style reminds them of things like Disney, Pixar, or even Fortnite, which, hey, I've been doing this a lot longer than they have, so maybe we should start saying Fortnite looks a little too much like Follygon's artwork, On a small side note, I was recently asked by Epic, the creators of Fortnite, to work on an upcoming project for them where I have complete design freedom to do whatever I want, but more on that in a future video. So after playing around with the face, trying a million different things, I decided to simplify. In total, it took me a little under an hour to go from nothing to this point here. And then after a short break, I come back and make a few more changes, making the eyes larger and rounding out the face to make it more appealing. In the past, this is something that would have taken me hours upon hours to figure out. That's one of the coolest things about creating art in my opinion, being able to look back and see how much faster you are now versus back then. Next up, it's time for me to work on the clothing a lot more. Luckily, because I'd done such a good job earlier with the blockout, I was able to fly through this part of the process. I work my way from top to bottom, beginning with the neck of his cloak, detailing out the shape and cleaning it up. Then I move on to the cape and do the same. I also add a little flare and asymmetry to make it billow out more from the body. For the arms, I unfortunately overmodeled on these a tad too much. So for now, I am creating some more detailed folds that, yeah, do look good, but don't work very well for the style I'm trying to achieve. The folds here start feeling more soft and realistic, where I'm going for something more sharp and stylized. But luckily I realized this mistake later on and fixed them. More on that soon, but first it's time for everyone's favorite segment.
Sculpting Advice with Follygon is filmed in front of a live studio audience. Here's a cool hack for you guys that I implement all the time. Whenever you need to create a loop of fabric or anything else around an object, you could of course take the time to use some kind of curve brush or insert new geometry and wrap it around your 3D object. However, that takes way too long and can be finicky as all get out, so don't be stupid. Let me show you how a smarty like me does it. Grab your slice curve brush. Duplicate your geometry. Make sure it doesn't have any subdivs. Slice it up once, slice it up nice, then delete the excess. Inflate, remesh, extrude. Bada bing, bada boom. You're welcome. This has been Sculpting Advice with Follygon, filmed in front of a live studio audience.
Whoa. Wow, I don't know what just came over me. Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah, the clothing. I love sculpting folds. Genuinely one of the most fun things to sculpt. So that is exactly what I am doing next. Starting off with the shirt, not placing folds randomly, I'm thinking about how the fabric would naturally fall based on the anatomy of the character, and placing appropriate folds where necessary. I once again go a little overboard in some areas, but don't worry, I fix it later on. Then I move on to the pants and give them the same treatment. Up until now, I've had what I'm going to call blob feet on this guy. And blob feet are great for a block out, but they aren't the quality that we want for a finished character. So that means it's time for me to utter a phrase I never thought I would say. It's time for me to sculpt Avatar Aang's feet. Ooh, not really. I'm actually only creating the boots that he's wearing. So for this part, because I didn't have a ton of reference to go off of, I put my AirPods in, turned on one of my favorite podcasts, Hey Riddle Riddle, and got to work sculpting. A lot of the time when sculpting, I try not to listen to anything because even small distractions can compound and make a character take a lot longer. But whenever I'm doing something monotonous that I've done a million times over, and I know I can do without even thinking, I'll put something on to help pass the time. After the boots are finished, I plug them into place, make a few adjustments, and call them finished. Because now it's time for me to move on to my personal favorite part of working on this character, and that is the sphere of air. Anytime you're sculpting hair, smoke, fire, or in this case, wind, you know it's going to be a good time. I love creating shapes like this with tons of flow that intermingle and have fun shapes on the micro level that add up to a really cool complete idea. And that is exactly what we have here with this sphere of air. So to start, I wrap a tube of geometry around my sphere. This is going to be my base shape. After creating a secondary piece to wrap around the sphere, I begin sculpting on my ribbons of wind, adjusting my shapes to feel more dynamic and interesting. Next, I experiment with having a few more pieces flowing around the outside. I overdo this at first and then delete most of them. It's typically better in my experience to have only a few points of interest on something like this, especially when it isn't the main focus of the character. Then I move on to sculpting directly on the sphere to give it some extra form. This takes me a few tries to get something that I enjoy, but I get there in the end. Finally, I wrap up by placing these really thin tubes around the sphere to help give it some extra detail, placing each by hand and adjusting them until I'm happy with the final look. Next up, I need to move on to the hands and face for some detailing and painting. I start with the hands, taking time to combine and blend the separated fingers. I adjust the larger forms to match the style of the character, then move on to the face for painting. Now up to this point, I was actually pretty happy with the face, so much so that I completely forgot how much a face can be improved by some simple paint. I start by adding some warmth to the ears, nose, and cheeks. This alone makes for some huge improvement. Then I add some subtle shadows to the ears and eyes. It's super easy to go overboard with this kind of paint, so I need to be very careful here, and in fact I overdo it at first, so I then have to take the time to clean things up and refine my almost shoddy paint job. Just take a look at the difference a little extra painting makes. Then I do the exact same thing to the hands and of course add on the arrow that had been missing up until this point. I add this with a mask and cut out the exact shape that I need before filling it in with blue. Now I know what you're thinking, Aang is posed, yes, but he looks a little stiff, and I couldn't agree more. So it's time for me to make this pose even more dynamic. I begin pushing on the pose to exaggerate the lean of his body, adding more twist, while also working on the facial expression. I add the tiniest amount of asymmetry there so that it doesn't feel too perfect. After this, I go through everything for one final pass to clean things up before sending it to Blender for rendering. Here is the finished sculpt in ZBrush versus what it looks like in Blender before I do any post-processing. There's an immediate huge difference in quality simply because of the physical lighting that we have in our render scene. And now it's time for the part that so many skip to, the final renders. You know, I've taught people that have worked at companies like Disney and people on their very first day of learning to sculpt. So if you would like to learn everything I know about sculpting characters, check out my program, The Appeal Academy, at the link in the description, and my online store for other tutorials and my custom brushes. And one last bonus free recommendation for you: if you enjoyed this video, you will love this one where I create Alistair from Has-Been Hotel. And everyone that did stick around here to the end, thank you so much for watching. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.